So with that, I just want to say again, we're so excited that we are partnering with Kaya Press on this book, which will be available soon from both our store at Janum and Kaya Press. So please make sure to sign up to get your copy of In Search of Hiroshi today. We'll put some links in the chat. And yeah, this book just fits in so well into what we do here at Janum and Discover Nikkei, which is exploring and sharing so many different facets of the Japanese American story and the Nikkei story around the world. So I could talk about this book, but I think the better person to do that is Anna Iwataki, who I'll be introducing now, who is a writer and curator from and based in Los Angeles. And she is the editor of this republication of In Search of Hiroshi, which, I'm sure you know, is the powerful memoir by Gene Oishi that was published by Kaya Press that we'll be discussing today. So with that, I'm going to pass the program over to Anna to get started. And thank you so much for doing this today and being part of this program.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Joy and Janum and Discover Nikkei for partnering with Kaya Press. Really thrilled to about this event and to be able to celebrate the republication of this memoir that was really an honor for me to work on. In Search of Hiroshi was originally published in 1988, and this revised edition has new essays as well as a conversation between Gene and his daughter Eve. And it follows Foxtrot Bebop that Kaya Press also, Gene's first book with Kaya Press published in 2014. So just a quick introduction to the memoir. Can one wreak vengeance against oneself? This anguished question hangs over Gene Oishi's powerful memoir about his lifelong struggle to claim both his Japanese and American identities in the aftermath of his childhood incarceration during World War II. Throughout his return to California as a teenager, his post-war service in the U.S. Army, and his subsequent career in journalism and politics, the deep wounds caused by the trauma of incarceration continue to fester, impacting his professional and personal lives. So today, we're going to be joined in conversation by Gene, of course, Gene, his daughter Eve, and Koji Lau-Ozawa, and we'll be exploring, that impact of Gene's experience during the war, as well as sort of the reverberations on his family life, as well as the intergenerational reverberations more broadly. Just to introduce everyone today, before we get started, Gene Oishi, former Washington and foreign correspondent for the Baltimore Sun, has written articles on the Japanese American experience for the New York Times Magazine, the Washington Post, Newsweek, and West Magazine. His book, Foxtrot Bebop, was published by Kaya Press in 2014, making him a debut novelist in his 80s. Now retired, he lives in Baltimore, Maryland with his wife, Sabine. Eve Oishi is Associate Professor of Cultural Studies at Claremont Graduate University, specializing in Asian American Media and Gender Studies. And Koji Lau-Ozawa is a UC Chancellor's postdoctoral fellow at UCLA and a descendant of incarcerees from the Gila River incarceration camp. He received his PhD at Stanford University in anthropology. Lau-Ozawa's work looks to the archaeology of Japanese diaspora broadly and the intersections between Japanese American and indigenous communities during World War II incarceration, including sites like Gila River. And he focuses on landscapes, objects, and memory to look at the materialized legacies of the past. And finally, just a brief note on Kaya Press. It was founded in 1994, so we're celebrating our 30th anniversary this year, a major milestone for Asian American literature. Since 1994, we've been publishing cutting-edge writers from the Asian and Pacific Island diasporas. Since its inception, Kaya Press has sought out stories, perspectives, and experiences that explode expectations about what it means to be an immigrant or to cross ethnic or social boundaries. Kaya publishes works that experiment not only with new perspectives, but new ways of expressing them. From South Korean science fiction to traditional Samoan storytelling to fictional autobiography to performance poetry, and it has also been instrumental in the rediscovery of long-lost classic Asian American text. All right, so that's it for the introductions. Hi, everyone. I'm so glad to be in conversation with you all today. So to get us started, Gene, I was hoping that you could just briefly touch on, how you came to write In Search of Hiroshi.
Well, the reason I wrote this novel was that most of my life I sort of had aspirations of being a writer and perhaps one day writing a novel. And after several attempts of writing a novel which didn't quite work out, I thought, well, I'll write about the Japanese American experience. But strangely enough, to indicate the degree of my oppression, so I wasn't going to deal with the internment during World War II because that was just the experience of a few years. And there's more to the Japanese American history than just that unfortunate incident. Well, I started writing a story of the Japanese American in novel form until I came up to the point when I was reached the protagonist arrives at the funeral of his father. And at that moment, for some reason, he says, "I am Japanese." And at that point, I broke into tears for a reason I had no idea I was going to have that reaction. And I couldn't write anymore. And my lips would start to freeze when I tried to speak, not just about Japanese, but anything. And I had a severe experience of physical repression. Well, I got over that, but it was very traumatic. I couldn't start writing again. But I did write, of course, news stories. And the National Geographic commissioned me to write a story about the Japanese American community as a success story about how this brave group of Americans recovered from their unfortunate experience of World War II and now were successful professionals and businessmen. So I went around the East Coast and Chicago, New York, even to Hawaii, to interview hundreds of Japanese Americans. And I have been living in the East Coast through most of my adult life, professional life, and had very little contact with other Japanese Americans. And the first time I got their reaction to how they really felt about the war and the incarceration. And that gave me the courage to think about my own experience. And that I've discovered only that these apparently outwardly very successful Japanese were still very deeply traumatically affected by that experience. And so I guess that gave me the permission to look more deeply into my emotional state of mind concerning internment. It was not a trivial event that we could let aside. It was something very, very central to our very being. And so I decided I'm going to write an autobiography. And the one requirement, and I did not think of autobiography as informing others about my experience, but I thought of it, my main goal was informing myself. I want to investigate my childhood and my thinking as honestly as I could. And my one criteria was, did it really happen this way? Did I really think this way? And that was my only criteria. I wanted it absolutely honest, whether anybody liked it or not. I didn't care. I was writing for myself. So that was the reason. That was Search of Hiroshi, and much to my surprise, can't remember the name of the publisher.
Charles Tuttle. Charles Tuttle.
Published it. And it came as a complete surprise to me. Yep. anybody would publish it.
I definitely want to come back to Charles Tuttle and the moment that it was published in 1988. But the writing started because you went back to camp in a way. You went back to this childhood experience, and I would like our conversation today to sort of go back to that place as well. So maybe you can just say a few words about, first where you were during the war. And well, I'd like everyone basically to talk about what incarceration has meant to them in their lives, the significance of Gila River in particular, and what it has meant and continues to mean in your life and your work. And Gene, if you could start, and then maybe Eve, you could take up the same question.
I didn't quite get your question. You want me to talk about my years spent in the concentration camps?
Just a few words about about where you were first.
Well, I was first. They sent us to what is called an assembly center in Tulare, California, which is sort of a temporary placement place before the more permanent camps were built in the interior. And this in Tulare, this assembly center they called it, was structurally much more prison-like than the ones later built in the interior. There were two barbed wire fences, I guess about 8 feet tall, and there were patrol guards, armed soldiers with fixed bayonets patrolling the space between the two fences. And there were also towers, guard towers placed some distance apart, each equipped with, I believe there were two soldiers that had a searchlight and a machine gun, a 50 caliber machine gun, those big round ones that look like rolling pins. And they were, of course, pointed inside towards the. I point this out to people who say we were put there for our own protection. No, the machine guns were aimed towards us in the camp. And at night, the searchlight would rake the barbed wire fences to make sure that nobody got out. And it was made clear to us, very physically clear to us, that we were in a prison. We were not in a relocation center. But the relocation center was not so severely guarded, but they were in the middle of the wilderness, so there was not many places we could have gone anyway. But it was very primitive structure. But eventually, the Japanese would steal lumber from the warehouses and build furniture, and made it and started planting castor plants, making fish ponds, and made it as civilized as possible, as much as possible in that kind of environment. And the biggest struggle, of course, the controversy was the loyalty questions, and the whether or not we are loyal to America or to Japan, and whether we're willing to serve in the armed forces. And that was a big issue. And many Nisei were eager to say, yes, we're completely loyal, we'll serve in the armed forces. Others were insulted. You put us in concentration camps and want us to serve in your goddamn army? That was more or less understandable anger about asking us about the loyalty after we were treated the way we were. Mm-hmm. But after that was settled and people left the camp, went declared their loyalty and were allowed to leave or were drafted into the army, it settled down to a very quiet existence with old people and children. And actually, I have to tell you, it wasn't bad. I learned to love the desert, and I was more afraid of going back to the real world. Mm-hmm. To be staying there. I mean, I had a lot of fun, I have to say, in the camp. Towards the end, when everything was quiet.
I think that, there are several moments when you reflect on that, what the desert meant to you, and the tension of it being at, a safe place and a traumatic place is, one of the most powerful things about the memoir. And then, of course, your conversation with Eve begins in a return to Gila, a family trip. So maybe, Eve, you can talk about, that trip and, in a broader, more abstract way, what Gila meant to your family.
Sure. Thank you so much for hosting this conversation and letting us have this opportunity to have this conversation, not only with each other, but sort of cross generationally, adding another generation to the mix, 2 more generations, I guess. I would say that I was born and raised in Baltimore, Maryland, and that's not insignificant. I think the fact that I was born and raised away from a Japanese American community, even the fact that I am biracial, and that my mother is not Japanese American, all of those are results of my father's experience at Gila River. And so even though it's kind of a roundabout way of thinking about the effects of the camp, they are really baked into my identity at the very cellular level. And so that experience has been incredibly central, even if it's not one that we often talked about when I was younger, because we didn't have a Japanese, we weren't with our Japanese American family, we weren't with other Japanese Americans. When we would visit with them, and when we'd be around other Nisei, they would often talk about camp. I certainly knew about camp. I knew about my dad's childhood in camp. He would talk about it, but they would always say camp. It was just, that was the code word. We were at camp, in camp, which has these, kind of the sense of vacation, of kind of summer camp. So it was just this one word that got used that didn't really talk about a lot. But at the same time, we were an unusual family in that my father, because he was a writer and because he was processing this history through his writing, we had a lot of access to his process. And, we'd shared this story with you when we had talked earlier about how when my dad first started writing fiction, before he decided to go to the autobiography, when he started writing fiction about his childhood, I was in middle school and I'd taken a typing class and I learned how to type, and I'd gotten a typewriter. And so he paid me to type his drafts. And so I would type all these stories about his childhood, and learned a lot about his life that way. And I didn't realize that he didn't know, and he didn't realize. It was only very recently that we talked about this experience, and that I learned that he didn't know that I was reading this. He thought I was just typing it without reading it. So anyway, but I did certainly, kind of learn about a lot of his stories. And then once he started writing In Search of Hiroshi, it was, as he talks about in the book, it was part of a process of kind of a psychological crisis. And so that was, of course, something that affected the family. And so we did talk about that a lot. And we were involved in a family therapy project about it. And, so it's something that our family has spent a lot of time talking about, which I think is really unusual for Japanese American families. And then in 2000, when I was already a professor, specializing in Asian American Studies and a member of the Association for Asian American Studies, there was a conference was being held in Scottsdale, Arizona, which was near Gila, and there was going to be a tour of the site planned as part of the conference. And so I suggested to my dad that we submit a paper together. We propose a paper, which was accepted. And so we kind of wrote back and forth different parts of the paper in advance. And then we went a few days before the conference started and we visited the site together. And then we went back to our hotels and we kind of worked on the rest of the paper and delivered it together. So that paper is now included in this new republication of In Search of Hiroshi with a new little preface by me. So
I'd like to say something about that paper. When I told the elderly Nisei man that my daughter and I had written a paper about the incarceration, he goes shocked. He says, "How can you involve your own daughter in that shame?" So I said, "Well, it was her idea, not mine." But that's how he thought about the whole thing. It was very shameful, and you should keep your children away from it.
In a Japanese American family in therapy together talking about camp is something I'd certainly never heard before. So it's my own kind of Nisei man shock.
well, that was actually there was a therapist named Nobu Miyoshi, a Japanese American therapist who lived in Philadelphia, who contacted us actually. She was part of a project. I can't remember. It was affiliated with some, I think I want to say University of Chicago or some university, and they had a grant and they were doing family therapy for Japanese American families.
Wow.
Yeah, it was amazing. And so I was living in Philly at the time, and my she would sometimes come down to Baltimore. They would come up, we would all meet, and we would do this therapy, which was motivated by trying to kind of break through the silences of that experience. But of course, you know, it's family systems therapy. It's like, it's going to be about all these other family issues are going to come up. Everything is connected. And my mom is a therapist. And so, you know, we were very kind of, you know, pro therapy already. But yeah, that was a really interesting project. I'd like to kind of find out more about it. I don't really remember much.
And I'm assuming that you were contacted because of your father's writing?
I don't know how she got my name, possibly through my book, but her main interest was in the third generation.
I see.
How the interminate experience affected the third generation. That was her focus mainly.
So, you know, Koji, maybe you can talk about, you know, how you came to your work, and yeah, maybe, you know, how the personal and scholarship has come together for you, just as it has for Eve.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for including me in this wonderful conversation about this about Gene's work. And so I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area. I'm Sansei and a half. My grandfather was Issei and my grandmother was Nisei, from Pasadena. And sort of like Eve was saying, I would grow up hearing about camp, but really that was all. There'd be camp or Gila, and then mostly be a time marker. That was before camp, or that was after camp. That was before Gila. That was after Gila. And it was never really unpacked or explored or discussed beyond that as sort of a temporal marker before or after camp, before or after Gila. And there was a lot of silences around it in my family. My grandfather would never talk about it at all. My grandmother would only talk about it much later after I started my research. And I'm an archaeologist. I went to do archaeology in Scotland for university, and then came back to the US and worked in archaeology for a few years, and thought I was going to go do a PhD on Egyptian archaeology and history, and went and did a master's at San Francisco State, and was talking with a friend about what to do for a master's project. And she said, well, why don't you do something about the camp experience? I don't think there's much written about Gila River in archaeology. So I sort of looked out and ended up contacting the Gila River Indian community, on whose reservation the camp was, and who manages the remains of the camp. And they're very supportive. And this was sort of like a hard turn in my life and my relationship with camp history, from this period where it was just this vague notion of something that had happened, to a period where I ended up doing a deep dive into the Gila River. And so that was in 2014. And I started to read as much as I could about Gila, started to talk to family members. I interviewed my grandmother when she turned 100 in 2015, and she talked a little bit about her experience. And then I began to find resources like Gene's book, and it was just so impactful to see this sort of firsthand narrative, and see the stories where I could only have sort of guesses about my own family's experience, going from Pasadena to Tulare to Gila. But to see that sort of written about so raw and honestly by Gene was really impactful to how I understood camp, and how I understood what the experiences were. And you know, I have some aunties who were about 9 or 10 going into camp, who to this day will tell me like, "Oh, we don't want to talk about it. I'm happy that you're researching it. I think it's good, but I don't want to talk about my time there at all." And I think those are still, those traumas and silences are held within a lot of members of our community, and a lot of the families that I've spoken to. And so I think it's just so critical to have these resources that talk about both the experience of camp, and that struggle with what it means to be Japanese and American, and to rectify those two things within the context of incarceration. So I've been so fortunate to have these as I work on Gila River, looking at the intersections of the camp experience and native reservations, as well as the gardens and the experiences of people inside Gila through archaeology.
Thank you so much, Koji. You know, it's really lovely to hear about how, you know, the discovery of this book impacted you on such a visceral level, as well as sort of, you know, how it's like influenced your academic work. You know, it really struck me when I asked Eugene to talk about camp, to just say a few words about where you were. You know, you immediately painted such picture of immediacy for us. You know, you were talking about the materials, and really, you know, giving us a real sense of place and what life was like there. And, you know, that's what the book does. We, you know, have a sense of not only what, you know, these images that we all have from, you know, one source or another, but yeah, the sort of viscerality and how that turns into something that's like, you know, that lingers. And, you know, that's something that we were really hoping that the republication of this book would do. You know, it's coming out in 2024, and it's a different, you know, it's going to reach a different audience than it did in 1988. There are different, you know, JANM did not exist in 1988 when the book was first published. There were fewer platforms to have these kinds of conversations. Gene, you've talked about you know, feeling like you didn't have connection with Japanese American readers when book first came out. Kaya Press is a very different kind of press from the Charles Tuttle Company. And, maybe you could tell us a little bit about what it's been, how you've thought about the book coming out now in 2024 versus 1988. And then I'd like to hear Eve talk about that as well.
You want me to talk about? Are you addressing me?
Yes, yes. Maybe some of the things that you talked about in the new prologue.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. The context is quite different today than it was when I wrote the book, because in that period in 1988, I was not quite firm in my own identity. I was exploring my Japanese heritage and to see how it fits in, and I wasn't quite sure whether I was Japanese or American. I knew culturally I was much more American than I was Japanese. I spent 6 months in Japan visiting my relatives, became very fluent in Japanese again, and I felt very comfortable in Japan. And I even had thoughts about possibly staying here and spending the rest of my life in Japan. But I really couldn't have lived, had a decent living. My spoken Japanese was good, but my writing was not very much. There was much left of it, whatever there was, and I came to a realization in Japan that I was not really Japanese. From the point of view of heritage, I was Japanese, but I was an American, and I had to make my life in America. But it was a struggle for me to think of myself as an American. But over the past 30 years, I have gradually now think of myself as an American. I fully consider myself an American, a Japanese American, but an American. And so the way I view the world today, the way America is going today, I'm very disturbed, very angry, and afraid of what this country is coming to, because it has become very anti-American in the way I view what Americanism is. Because America, in spite of all its flaws, in spite of its history of bigotry and prejudice, has always been on an upward trend. We have always slowly, with some backward steps, have gone forward. And now we're in the danger of going, not just sliding backwards, but going, I don't know what we're turning into. I'm very deeply afraid today. As an American, I see it as an American, and I'm afraid for my own country.
And I think that the broad overview, the sort of longue durée of your memoir, now that it's contextualized by this moment, and I think it is an important moment to revisit your perspective and how you've experienced it as sort of at once a participant, but also an analyst. You were a political journalist. That was your career was spent analyzing the trends of this country, and that was of course informed by your childhood, but as you write about the personal and professional, there was a separation for a long period, and it came together in different kinds of writing. It came together first in fiction and then in writing the memoir. But the way you bring us through that journey, that progression in the memoir is really, again, one of the things that I've found most valuable personally, seeing how different kinds of writing helped shape your perspective of this country's history and this country's present. And yeah, again, the going back to different time periods, including, when it was published, when you were experiencing, becoming a journalist, the war, the historicization is really, yeah, it's done in, both personal and professional way. I will wrap up that thought. But, Eve, you talked about being in Japan as well, during when the book was published. And so maybe you could talk about your experience in Japan.
Sure. I did a year. I lived in Japan for a year. I did the JET program for a year after college, and it was right after the book had come out. And I was teaching English in high schools, and so the other English teachers, the Japanese English teachers who wanted to practice their English, they suggested a book club, and so they suggested that we read my dad's book at the book club, which I thought was, I don't know how they knew about it, but it was a bit. I mean, Charles Tuttle's books, were sold at Kinokuniya in Tokyo. That was one of his main. That was one of that company's. They published books on Japan for non-Japanese audiences, and so Kinokuniya was the English language bookstore. But anyway, I thought it was really interesting that they were so interested in this history, and were interested in Japanese American history. So yeah, we read that, and then I'm sorry, what was the other question?
Oh, I just reflecting on the different moments, and maybe this would be a nice time to talk about how you discovered Koji's work, and why you decided to bring in Koji and other younger Japanese American scholars in your reflections on the memoir today.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, one of the ways to think about this also is, we're thinking about the difference between 1988 and 2024, but there's also the difference between 2000 and 2024 when we first wrote that paper and delivered that paper, which, was almost 25 years ago, which seems incredible that it was that long. But when Kaya asked us to include that paper in this book, and I went back and I hadn't looked at it in so long, it was really interesting to see how dated it felt in many ways. And so I felt like I needed to add an extra introduction just to kind of update my thinking about these questions. And so one of the things I did is I looked for research that, more recent research on Gila. And I found Koji's work. And now I can't remember if that was before or after we met, but we happened to be at Stanford at the same time, and it was a great coincidence. And so we got to know each other that way. So I got to know more about his work. But he is, I think, representative of a new generation of scholars who are really thinking intersectionally about these questions. So it was really important. I think one of the things that's really valuable about your work, Koji, is the way that you are really understanding the history of Japanese incarceration as tied together with and inseparable from the histories of the indigenous communities upon which whose land was being settled basically by these and taken over by these camps. And so to kind of excavate that history and to understand it, you have to think about both of those two things together. So that was just one framework that was really helpful for me to kind of rethink how I understood the desert, and the place of the camp. also, I was struck by how different the language is now. I mean, we used to say internment. Internment was just the word. And it was the way that internment was the way that you signaled this is a Japanese American experience, right? Then you didn't really have to say Japanese American. You just said internment, because that just meant that was this unique chapter in history. But now, people talk about it as incarceration, as imprisonment, and people are linking it to these larger critiques of carcerality and mass incarceration, which then connects the Japanese American experience with all kinds of other people's experiences, and it makes not only the analysis much richer, but it makes clear a lot of the kind of links that different groups have in terms of political alliance and coalition politics. Yeah, so it was great to be introduced to Koji's work and then to meet him personally, and it was really important that I really wanted to have him included in this conversation, because I just feel like to see the way that scholars are taking up this, not only scholars, but people who have whose personal histories are part of this, how they're kind of moving the field forward in these really exciting ways.
Yeah, one of the things that I'll always remember from some of our conversations, Gene, when we were working together on the book, is, you telling me, I asked you something about what you hoped, or what you thought younger generations might take from the book, and you just said something to the effect of, well, that's for you to write. It's for the younger people to. It's not your job to decide that for anyone. And I maybe just with the few minutes that we have before we move to the questions, Koji, maybe you could talk about some of your work. I think, I would love to hear, just about maybe one of the projects connected to Gila.
Sure. Yeah, thank you so much, Eve, for that you expressed my work more beautifully than I could. You're so complimentary. I've been working in collaboration with the Gila River Indian community for the last 10 years now, to understand the Gila River incarceration camp from a lot of different perspectives. And one of the things, I think that speaks to Gene's comment earlier about finding the desert actually beautiful, and this space not just of confinement but of safety at times, that really struck me was the way in which simultaneously the placement of the camp on the reservation on ancestral O'odham land and confining Japanese Americans brought all these different relationships to the landscape together. And there was this sort of carceral layer that gets placed from the camp by the federal government. And that's what I see when I look at these structures and the foundations and the grid lines of the camp. But then there are ways in which Japanese Americans built these beautiful gardens. I've documented with my partners at Gila River over 230 garden ponds, these beautiful structures, rock gardens, landscaping that people did that literally transformed the environment to make it the dust storms less severe, the wind breaks from the castor beans, the coolness from the water rather than the exposed soil. And then at the same time, incorporating things like saguaro cactuses into their landscaping features, and then hearing stories from my O'odham friends and collaborators about saguaros as Hashan and people in O'odham ontologies, and how they think of saguaros as holding memories in these landscapes and witnessing the camp. and the relationships between Japanese Americans who photograph themselves with saguaro and often people who think of saguaros as holding these memories, and how those relationships again come together on these landscapes. And so I think one thing I've been interested in and trying to relate to is not allowing the violence and the carcerality of the landscape by the government to dominate that and to dominate those memories, but to find these other expressions and understandings. And I just want to also say real quickly, as I was paging back through In Search of Hiroshi to prep for this, I came back, Gene, you wrote about talking to somebody and seeing your brother's name in an archival document and being moved to tears. And I found that so incredible when I was doing archival research at the National Archives. I was paging through a box of record group 210, this huge archive, and I came across a paper of my grandparents' name in a record. It was like a random permit record. And I was there in the archive, and I just started crying. I didn't know why. I didn't know what to do about it. But reading your experience as well, and that really brought me back, and just to the ways in which relating to this history can touch you in ways that you don't understand. And I really appreciate your discussion of that. And again, trying to search through my own relationship to this history, to my family, to the silences, and what that means.
I'm glad to hear that, because it's always been a mystery to me how that affected me emotionally. I just broke down completely. See, my brother's this governmental document. It was a terrific blow. But I'm glad. I'm happy you shared that your experience with the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, there's something really violent, about. I mean, it just seems like such a simple thing to have a name in a document, but it holds all this, unspoken power of someone being captured and confined and reduced to just a statistic or a name in a administrative record. There's so much violence that holds that is not necessarily apparent from the record unless someone has a personal relationship to it, and then it just kind of releases all of that.
Also, the camps were how these barracks were beautified. They would grow flowers and decide to build dresses, build clinging vines and flowers, and they built rock gardens and even pools and with fish in it and turtles from the Colorado River. This was in the other camp, Poston. But they did whatever they could to civilize the camp with various sculptures and work with the tools they have. And they went out to the desert to get petrified wood to make sculptures out of petrified wood. And they had courses on sculpturing using wood. They had, I don't know what they used for flowers, but the women had flower arrangement classes. So they, in this barbaric conditioning of a concentration camp, they tried to beautify it. They tried to engage in artworks. And I was just a child, and I could. It struck me then, but I didn't know quite what to make of it. And when I think of it now, I'm very impressed by the courage of the people to make something there, not just out of nothing, but something so negative. It was a way of surviving. We're still here. We're still people. We can still create.
So this is actually a perfect transition into our first question from Seshu Foster, and I'll just read the whole question. He says, I'm writing a book now based on the JA community on the Central California coast, Guadalupe, San Luis Obispo, Santa Maria, and Arroyo Grande, and I'm interested in Gene's statement that JA history is a lot more than camp trauma. Can Gene and anyone else elaborate on that? And he also mentions that that the Central Coast was described as a kind of a golden age for the JA community. And he wants to know if that was your experience of it. Gene. So, you know, the question is about, you know, JA history being more than just trauma, more than just the trauma of camp. And, you know, we're talking about all these ways that, you know, beauty and poetry was part of daily life and can be part of the way we remember it. And so, you know, someone wants to know how we can think about, you know, before camp, you know, where your childhood before camp, if you felt that the Central Coast was a golden age for the JA community, a golden age of JA history.
Well, you know, the camp has to be in the context of the history of immigration.
Mm-hmm.
All the Chinese, well, I know, you know, even the immigrants from Europe, especially from Southern Europe and from Eastern Europe, and Jews, were intense discrimination and hatred against these immigrants as newcomers. This was seen as a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant country, and Catholics were first found to be a threat. Then these others, dark-skinned people from Southern Europe. But there were some limits to it. Eventually, these people from Europe were slowly integrated into the American society, especially the Irish, mainly because they spoke English. You know, became very powerful politically. But the immigrants from Asia, non-white people, the prejudice, the hatred against them never faded. The hatred against the Chinese was intense, and eventually, of course, I mean, they were actually put on railroad cars and shipped out of town. The settlements were burnt. The violence against the Chinese was intense, and eventually, in the late 19th century, they were banned from coming. Then, of course, there were the Japanese still left, and then eventually the hatred and the prejudice, the biases focused then on the remaining nations, which were the Japanese, and we too were stopped in 1924. All immigration from Japan was stopped, and that continued. I mean, that those of us who still remained were tolerated. But of course, when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, it exploded. But the hatred and bigotry was already there, and it just needed a spark. There was more to the spark, of course, with the Japanese bomb. But that brought forth the deep suspicions and hatred for the Japanese that existed. So it was no surprise that even when it was known that the Japanese did not pose any security problems. The military knew that by the time we were incarcerated, the Japanese naval force was depleted. They no longer had the military ability to attack the mainland of the United States. They just didn't. After the Battle of Midway and Coral Sea, the Japanese Navy was completely crippled and had no power to conduct any kind of military aggression against the mainland. So they knew it was just political. It was symbolic, an expression of the hatred of the Asian people. And that has changed. That has changed a lot. I guess mainly because of the increase in and the immigration from Asia. There are much more Asians proposing, not just Asians but from Latin America. The United States is no longer dominantly white. It's become a nation of mixed races, and that's a healthy thing, I think. And but it's also generating the kind of backlash that as we're seeing now. I think that is the backlash we're seeing is, I think, largely racist. They don't like to see the white race losing its dominance that it once had. But by population figures, the majority of people in the United States are still white, but that's just barely. I mean, that's not going to last, and that's what frightens, I think, a lot of people.
One of the things that I always found so interesting about both In Search of Hiroshi and then Foxdrum Bebop takes it up in different ways when you talk about Guadalupe is how multicultural it was. I mean, the Japanese American story is also so much about at least in the Central Coast, so much about the Italian Americans, the Filipinos, the Mexican Americans. I mean, there are all of these different kind of ethnic groups. There were class differences, of course, between them, but then also the Japanese American community is painted as so diverse too. I mean, there's so many different divisions among people's relationship, generations and relationship to Japan and America that all were really tested and kind of came out with the internment and the loyalty oath, especially so the incarceration became a way of putting pressure on all of that diversity that was already there.
No, until rather recently, an American, when you said an American, it was a white face. It was American and the white race was synonymous. And so that I remember Gillette putting out an ad that their razor blade was meant for the American face. And it showed about eight very handsome American men. They looked like movie stars. There was one very light-skinned black man, but he also had very Caucasian features, but you could barely see that he was black. So they had to include him, but the American face was most uniformly white. There was no Asians, there were no South Americans, Mexicans. It was very Anglo-Saxon. So that was the white face, and that was not that long ago. And it's only now. I mean, the election of Obama as president of the United States was a total shock to me. And I thought, wow, we have arrived. We have finally arrived where racism no longer thrives in the United States, that we are capable of electing a black man as the president. Well,
Gene, I really want to ask you something.
we are facing the backlash.
There's a very interesting exchange happening in the chat about the Tuttle Publishing Company. And there's a lot of curiosity about who was who was making the decision to publish all of this great Japanese American literature. So can you tell us anything about who brought you in and who your editor was at Tuttle? Or
Well,
how did they find you?
Oh, my agent. I had my agent was an agent in Los Angeles. Of a friend of mine on the Sun staff had him as an agent and published books of his. And so he recommended me to the agent, and the agent took me on. And I think think the first place he sent it to was Tuttle. Well, I never would have thought of doing that, but he was familiar with the publishing business, and he sent it to the Tuttle, and they accepted it. And the agent and the person at the Tuttle that dealt with the book was very sympathetic. I was off the book. She said, "This is exactly the book we've been waiting for." I don't know why they were waiting for it, but that's what she said. This is exactly the book we were waiting for. And I had another editor who was very hands-off. She hardly made any changes at all. In fact, I had to make some of the corrections of the grammar. So it was pretty much exactly the way it was written. There was no editing to speak of. But they said it was just the book they were waiting for. Who knows why?
Okay, I want to make sure we answer. There's just a couple other questions in the queue in the chat. So someone's asking about patriotism and loyalty in the community. They're asking, my family's experience is from the Hawaiian perspective, where so much need was placed on proving one's loyalty, patriotism, and honor, leading the majority of our Nisei to volunteer for the war. And how prominent were the ideas of patriotism and loyalty in your community?
I didn't quite get the question.
Oh, what do you remember about patriotism in, yeah.
Yeah, the Japanese American Citizens League was formed very early on. They were mostly Japanese American citizens who most of them college graduates, and they were intensely patriotic. They wanted to establish a Japanese American community as an American group. And when the World War II started, with the bombing of Pearl Harbor, they were very, very active in trying to convince the government that we were loyal Americans. And when that didn't work, then they turned to say, well, we're going to show our patriotism by cooperating with the government, and so that the internment, which was what it was called, would be done in an orderly and humane way. And then after we were in the camps, they lobbied for Japanese to be accepted for the draft and to be able to volunteer for service in the armed forces. That was a very controversial, JCL was a very controversial organization, super loyal, and a lot of Nisei who thought of themselves as Americans felt betrayed. And so there was this conflict between those who felt betrayed and those wanted to prove 100% Americans, and those who had mixed feelings about it. They had their parents. Their parents are never going to be released, and they didn't want to be drafted because who's going to then look after their parents? So there was a lot of mixed feelings, and some people were understandably very bitter about serving the United States, who were treating them in this manner, putting them in concentration camps without any proof of disloyalty, just assuming because we were Japanese that we were disloyal. But eventually, of course, the record will indicate that most Japanese Nisei didn't resist the draft, as many volunteered, especially from Hawaii. The majority of the volunteers came from Hawaii because they were not incarcerated. And they wanted to show that they were loyal Americans. They volunteered en masse. I think some 10,000 Hawaiians, I think, volunteered the first day that was open to them. But that was the biggest point of political controversy in the camps, was the question of loyalty. And, of course, they had the questionnaire of whether you are or are not loyal. And some Nisei said, yeah, I'll say yes, but you have to, first of all, let me go back to my home. Then I'll tell you I'm loyal. But as long as I'm incarcerated in a concentration camp, hell no, I'm not going to say I'm loyal to this kid. I mean, that's a very American way of looking at it, right? I mean, that's how Americans should react to the situation. But that was considered very negative.
I know we're a little bit past time, but I want to just ask this get to this last question, because there's a really wonderful conversation going on between a lot of Japanese American writers in the chat right now. We have a real lineage present. So Naomi Hirahara is asking about your trajectory as a writer. She said, Gene is remarkable, a Nisei from Guadalupe who was incarcerated in Gila, who goes on to be a political journalist for the Baltimore Sun. Did you show a propensity for writing at a young age? And what do you think brought you to write for a major newspaper on the East Coast? How did that happen?
Well, I was always interested in literature because my mother was a great reader. She only had a 5th grade education in Japan, but she loved to read. Every spare chance she had, she read. And I was a very sickly child. And she would, when I got sick, and even when I was not sick, she would read to me, and I would beg her all the time, Mama yonde, read to me, read to me. And she kept, my early childhood was spent with my mother reading stories to me. So I just loved stories. And then as I got old enough to read for myself, I just, read everything I could get my hands on. And my brothers, two of my brothers went to Sanford and took English courses. So they had a lot of fiction novels, people like Sinclair Lewis and Mark Twain. And so I read those very early. And I don't know, I just love to write. When I was in high school, I would write essays for myself. I'd sit down at night and just write things, my own thoughts. And I would show it to my English teacher, and she would say, I don't understand a word of it, and give it back to me. but I was very experimental in those days. And the reason I finally ended up being a newspaper reporter was that was a job in which I got paid for writing, and I love to write. But my relationship with my first book was, as I said earlier, very complicated, because I didn't, at that point, I wasn't really prepared to face my past, to face my wartime experience. I was not really prepared to look honestly into it, and I was not emotionally capable, especially in fiction, to address that, because fiction requires a great deal, like music requires a sort of an emotional response to things, not just intellectual, but also emotional. And I was not capable of doing that. I would just break down in tears. And there was a time, as I said earlier, my lips began to freeze and I had trouble talking. And that was really psychosomatic. And I knew it at the time, but I couldn't help it. I couldn't control my mouth. I mean, I couldn't speak. I had difficulty speaking. That was a strong indication that there was something very traumatic inside it, going on inside of it. I forgot the other part of the question.
No,
If there
that
was.
was,
Oh.
I think that was a perfect answer. Perfect. I'm sure all the writers here appreciated it, especially, moving from not being able to speak to, to these books that you've gifted all of us with. So, thank you so much. And yeah, thank you Koji and Eve, and really everyone in the chat. I hope that we can preserve the chat somehow. It's really a lot of curiosity about your book has sparked a lot of different threads of conversation, and I hope we're all able to continue it in one way or another.
I see my cousin Carol is on here. So there's some Oishi family members here too. Hi, Carol.
Well, thank you again, to all of you for being here, and, Gene, for your work, and, to everyone who came and spent an hour with us today. And please buy the book. It's available. Well, it will be available through the Janum bookstore. Yeah, there it is. And, as well as Foxtrom Bebop. They pair very nicely together. There we go. Well, thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
Anna.
you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Yes, we'll definitely be saving the chat, but thank you, Anna. Thank you, Gene, Eve, Koji, for such a wonderful conversation. And yes, please buy the book. We'll put the link in the chat, and have a great rest of your day wherever you're calling in from.